correspondent Dan Moran. Welcome to the Long Island Radio Magazine. It being the eve of St. Patrick's Day, I've brought aboard a most interesting and insightful Irishman and a fellow Irish-American, Peter A. Quinn. Peter has achieved wide recognition, especially among the Irish-American community, following the publication of a most wonderful historical novel in 1994 entitled Banished Children of Eve. It is a historical setting which, aside from its compelling stories of several lives at the time of the New York draft riots during the Civil War, is a most palpable description of life in New York City at the time of economic polarization, the paralyzing influx of refugees, especially in large numbers from Ireland and elsewhere, and the adolescence of the world's greatest city. Mr. Quinn is considered an authority on Irishness and its various implications, and of course some 40 million of us in the United States claim Irish heritage. Each one of us and millions of others around the world share something which even the best among us are wont to explain: what it is to be Irish. Welcome, Peter Quinn.
Thank you, Dan. It's nice to be here.
Peter, as I get older, I find myself drawn ever more strongly to a search for the past which for so many of us was erased from record and memory for the sake of assimilation and perhaps survival. Today I feel somewhat like an adopted child, in some ways as fearful of the truth as of not finding it. I've attempted to fill in the blanks of my own personal history, but it only resembles, unfortunately, the history of the Irish in general, and I've not been able to find many of the particulars of my own family predating their arrival in the United States. Is this something what might have driven you to examine your own Irishness and write The Banished Children of Eve?
It's exactly the same experience. I got out of Manhattan College in 1969, and I joined Vista, and I went to Kansas City, Kansas, and I was really thinking of going to California, leave the whole thing behind, the Bronx, and I was there in 1969, 1970 that I first looked back and said, what was that all about? That my family had landed in New York, the first members that came to the United States during the famine in 1847, and in about 120 years we had managed to get from South Street to Tremont Avenue in the Bronx. And I just felt that there was an epic there, that it was just something that, it was a story that had never been told and that I wanted to try to tell. And really from that point, from 1970, I didn't start writing the book until 1980, well, I began to research it in 1982. And I researched for 10 years, and then I began to write.
Now, of course, this is a very long and complicated story, but what is the background of what caused so many Irish people to come here in the 1850s especially?
This is the 150th anniversary of it, the Great Famine, which is the defining event of modern Irish history and modern Irish-American history. It begins in 1845 with the potato failure and goes on into the early 1850s. 1/8 of the Irish population dies, and 2.1 million people leave within a 10-year period. There's nothing like that in Western Europe between the 30 Years' War and World War II. The level of civilian suffering, the dissolution of Irish culture, it's the trauma, the defining trauma of Irish history. And as you were saying in the beginning, it was really never dealt with. It was buried. There was a folk memory of a general memory that this was a terrible event, but the particulars of it most of them were lost.
Now, what was it politically that caused all this to happen? Was there some precipitating factor in causing this famine and all this hardship?
Well, there was a potato failure. There was a food shortage that in 1845 the British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, who was the Tory Prime Minister, tried to deal with by importing American corn. Then there was a great deal of suffering even with that. But in 1847, the new Whig government really turned its back on Ireland. It stopped all relief from Britain, said that they're really, this is just another case of the Irish draining the British purse. And beyond that, it passed the Poor Law Extension Act, which was nothing more than a charter for clearing the land. During the worst famine in modern Western European history, 500,000 people were evicted from farms in Ireland. So it's not just some agricultural accident in history that you had all these deaths. I mean, there was a food crisis that was mismanaged and at points deliberately managed by the British government to clear the land.
Now, I would have to say that your book spoke in very colorful and with a sense that you could almost smell and feel the way that New York was for these people when they came here. Many of them believed that they were coming to some place much better than the place that they had left, but unfortunately were surprised frequently at the conditions that they found. I was wondering if you could just give us a quick thumbnail sketch of what life was like in New York City around 1850.
Well, part of the people were not coming. That's what's different about the famine immigration. The immigration, I've said the famine was a wound that opened in Ireland and never clotted. It just bled and bled and bled. But what you had in the famine was there was this element of panic of people. They didn't know where they were going. There's a wonderful novel by Herman Melville that he wrote before Moby Dick called Redburn. And it's a novel about an immigration ship coming from Liverpool to the United States with Irish immigrants. And you have the sense these people have the vaguest idea of where they're going. They just know that they had to get out of Ireland. What happens in New York is you have 1 million people land on South Street in a 10-year period. Now, New York is a city of about 400,000 people at that point. And 1 million people coming from the most kind of primitive rural situation in Europe suddenly wind up in a big city. That is a replica of what's gone on in the third world, of rural people pouring by the millions who are not accustomed to urban life. And there are tremendous problems, just sanitation in New York. The leading cause of death in New York is diarrhea in the 1860s from tainted milk given to children, tuberculosis, cholera. The water supply, which is, what cholera comes from, people didn't know it at that point. They thought it was because people were dirty, so that was connected with the Irish, that they were dirty, so they brought cholera. And it's the social upheaval, it's the famine is not only a defining event in Irish history, in a way it's a defining event in New York City history. Mm-hmm. New York City becomes, to many people in the country, this threatening foreign place with this dangerous population of immigrants. Mm-hmm. And, the worst riot in American history is not in Los Angeles 5 years ago. It's in New York City in 1863. 3 times as many people die in the draft riots as in Los Angeles, and it's a white riot. It's an Irish riot. Mm-hmm.
I found it rather curious reading the book that the Irish were not backers of Abraham Lincoln because they felt as though he was going to emancipate the black slaves and that they would wind up threatening the Irish jobs. Which,
well, it's a complicated situation because you have the Irish Brigade on one hand. The Irish joined in immense numbers the Union Army and fought very bravely. But you also have on the other side the sense among the Irish that blacks are going to take away their jobs. Now, what had really happened was that the lower working class in New York was largely African American in the beginning of the 19th century, and it was the Irish who came in who underbid these people for the jobs and took the jobs away from them. But, it's a complicated situation in American cities that still goes on. The fight between Koreans and African Americans and Latin and Hispanics in Los Angeles. That the people at the bottom usually wind up fighting each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Irish have survived invasion and having their land taken, their God taken away from them, their schools taken away, and in fact their language taken away. And now perhaps it seems as though we really only need to survive ourselves. Do you feel as though there's ever going to be a resolution of all the difficulties in Northern Ireland at the moment?
I think so. I think what's going on, the famous, the so-called million Protestants in the North are about 900,000. I think there's going to be a demographic solution before a political solution. You're going to have a Catholic majority within, I think, 50 years, demographically. And then the British government is always saying they'll listen to the majority. So what are they going to do then? I mean, they created the state of Northern Ireland to have a Protestant majority. That's the whole idea of it. That's the catch-22 of the British presence there. They say we have to listen to the majority. Well, they cut a majority. They cut the 6 counties out to create a Protestant majority. But what happens when you have a Catholic majority? At this point, I think the British would like that they want to get out. They don't want to deal with this anymore. The empire is dead. They're going to give up Hong Kong, so all they have left now is Northern Ireland.
One of the things that I find, I meet many Irishmen out on the east end of Long Island here who are still coming in large numbers in the summertime to try to make a living from Ireland. Right. And one of the things that I find very curious about almost all of them is that no matter how long they're in the United States or how long any Irish American has been in the United States, they still see Ireland as being home. And they'll say things to me like, when do you expect to get back home again, as though, my family's been here for 100 years as some sort of a short vacation and then we're going to turn around again. What is it about the Irish mentality that makes them so devoted to Ireland?
I think it's the same thing in the Jewish mentality, of the sense of this lost homeland that we all took with us. Every family took, that they were leaving, but that they were not leaving, that a part of them was staying, that they were going. And even if it was just a myth, even if they had no intention of going back, there was the sense of, part of me is still there. In the 19th century, of course, people left and they were never going back. When they left, they had the thing called the American Wake, which was a person was literally dying when they left to go to the United States, because there was no money for ever going back. But there was a sense of something left behind, of something unresolved, something unfulfilled. I think so many Irish immigrants took that with them. That it wasn't just like we were going out, the Puritans, to start a new life as settlers. It was this feeling of something was not resolved in Ireland, that history had not worked out here, and that we're going to try to find something new, but we're carrying this old part of us with us. Tony O'Reilly said, the Irish are the first postmodern nationality, because you now have 4 million people in the country and 70 million outside of it. And the nationality is no longer attached to territory. It's a nationality of culture. It's a nationality of sentiment. It's a nationality of tradition. And that it's a complex nationality, because you can have Irish Australians, Irish Canadians, Irish Americans, all fitted in pretty well into the societies where they are, but a part of them still attached to this older identity. I'm a friend of Tom Keneally's, the guy who wrote Schindler's List.
Yes.
He's an amazing guy. His grandfather was a Fenian, deported to Australia. And just to show, cultural memory, he's now leading the movement in Australia to take the Union Jack out of the Australian flag.
Interesting. That would be a good idea, too. Now that you bring up some Irish writers, there must be something about Irish writers that I think that I've discovered. I wrote for many years, and I've said before, I believe even on this program, that I never really discovered what my voice as a writer was until I started reading Irish poetry. And then I found that there was a way of expressing things, or an attitude that seems to prevail among all Irish writers. Have you noticed such a thing?
I don't know among all Irish writers. I think because we were talking before about the Irish language, 2.1 million people left in the famine. A third of those were Irish speakers. And the thought that, we speak this language, that this fascination, maybe because it's not the language we had, and that we didn't just look on it like an English person presumes, well, this is the language that people speak. But I think maybe among the Irish there was the sense of, there's something magical in the language we had, and there's something foreign in this new language, and we look at it a little different then. I certainly think that's true with Joyce, who's, the definition of modern Irish literature. Everything comes out of him. He not only took over the English language, he dismantled it. They say he ended the English language in Finnegan's Wake. He took it. He not only took total possession of it, he dismantled it.
And reassembled it,
the final Irish revenge, not only to master the English language, but to demolish it. And I do see in so many Irish writers, I'm just reading this book, I'm going to review it for the Daily News, Reading in the Dark by Seamus Dean, and it's not that long a book, but it's taken me a long time to read because the language is so gorgeous. He just puts language together in a different way, and it's so rich and dense and magnificent.
That may be the Irish aspect. I found that even in your writing, that immediately I sort of just fell right into the book, and things were so descriptive, and there was absolutely a perspective that I don't remember seeing in other types of writing. It was very colorful and had tangible feelings to it. But that's sort of the thing that I think I was getting at about Irish writers, that there seems to be an attitude that shows through the writing in many ways. Well,
I find it, I have your book of poems, Sheltered by Islands, and it's the same thing. I guess that's the purpose of poetry, is to just put the language in your face more than in where writing is to take you along, where novels are to take you along on a story.
There was an interesting quote that I found from Joyce that I was going to throw at you, too, that he said that history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake.
Yeah, that's Stephen Daedalus and Ulysses, which is, the Irish attitude that they're the imperial histories in Europe. You have, Spain, France, England. Those are the histories that worked out, where the national identity was there, and even if they lost wars, it went on. But the Irish was the history that didn't work out. They didn't get the nation until very recently. And in the 19th century, when people came out from Ireland, there were no universities reflecting who they were. There was no official government. There was no museums. Nothing in the world reflected who they were. So that they had to carry this identity in themselves. And they carried it in song and in dance and in storytelling. That's what Irish culture was. And that's the other part, I think, about the Irish fascination with words and the importance of it. They didn't have an official culture. They didn't have an official literature. They didn't have an academy. It was in the people. It was in their storytelling. And it's interesting to me, the parallels between African-American and Irish-American culture, because if you look at African-Americans coming to American cities from the South, it's the same thing. They don't have an official culture. They're not reflected in the official institutions of society. And their identity resided in music, storytelling, dancing.
Have you read a book that had got a lot of attention the last couple of years called How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill?
Yes, I know Tom Cahill. It's interesting because there are two books that I reviewed them for America, the Jesuit magazine last year. How the Irish Became White and How the Irish Saved Civilization. I said this is apparently the Irish are going to have a whole series of how-to books.
But it was a source of great pride, thinking that the story of the book basically was that there were Irishmen who decided to be scholars who got their hands on various manuscripts. And some of these things go back a couple of thousand years, and tried to copy them by hand. And of course, in copying as many books as they could, they became very knowledgeable on the subject matter in the books, and were sought after as teachers and wise men, and were joined by other people who did similar things relative to copying manuscripts. And that, in fact, these things became monasteries, and even later, I believe, some universities as well, centers of learning. And
even there, though, it's interesting. The Irish are always on the periphery. That's one of the things in Tom's book, of that they're in European history, but they're not quite in it. And Ireland is a model for so many things in history, for the whole process of colonialism, for all the experiments of the westward moving frontier that begins on the east coast of the United States actually begin in Ireland, from the plantations to the removal of indigenous peoples to the destructions of cultures and removal of language. The Irish they're part of Western Europe, and they're not part of it. They're a nation to themselves, and they're a colony.
Last year,
why it's such a rich history, I think.
Yeah, there was something that I wanted to mention to you along that line. Last year I interviewed an Irish poet from Galway named Gerard Donovan, who's here teaching at the moment at Suffolk College. And I asked him how Ireland and the Irish mentality were unusual, and why they were unusual, perhaps. And what he said, which I hadn't thought about before and I think may ring true, is that because geographically Ireland is in fact an island, and behind it, in a manner of speaking, is the great history of Europe, and ahead of it is the Atlantic Ocean and the promise of the New World, and that they have been sitting on the fence in between those two places for many, many years, and that only creates sort of a national confusion, I believe, that they're not sure where to ally themselves.
Yeah, I think everything interesting comes out of confusion. The most interesting people are the ones who, because you can see two different worlds. You understand that it's not all just like this, which if you're from an imperial culture like English culture or French culture, there's one world view as far as they're concerned. And I think the Irish have always understood it's more confused than that. And maybe even the weather has something to do with it, that it's always misting and the landscape's always changing. But that seems to me part of the Irish mind, this kind of, the ability to deal with ambiguity, to understand the world's an ambiguous place.
Now, of course, it's said every St. Patrick's Day that there are only two kinds of people in the world, the Irish and those who wish they were Irish. And I'm wondering if you really think that that's true or not.
No, I think one of the tragedies of Irish history, there's been a lot of people who wish they weren't Irish who were Irish.
You and I had discussed that before, and I think that has created a great deal of difficulty in my own situation in trying to find out more about my own Irishness.
Yeah, I think one of the results of the famine of these people coming to the United States was not wanting to appear too foreign. How is it that if you have 2.1 million people and one-third are Irish-speaking, just the disappearance of the language tells you something. And, it had to be put aside, and the object was to get into America. And, of course, the great engine of assimilation, it was group solidarity and assimilation and education, the Catholic Church, that the Irish identity really for the whole period after the famine became the Catholic Church. And now I think there's a beginning of a separation. You have a secularization going on in Ireland and in Irish America, and it's no longer an immediate identification. There's now, I think, the revival of poetry and writing and examination of the Irish identity is partly a result of secularization. And I can say, as a Catholic, that I think it's a healthy thing, the separation of religion and national identity.
Yeah, and thinking about that and why Catholicism has been so important to the Irish over the years, it dawned on me that in the days back in Ireland when they were denied their own government and their own culture, that the church perhaps and the local priest was the person that they had to invest themselves in as much as possible as an authority figure or a savior of some sort.
Well, the whole modern church really comes out. There's a book by Emmett Larkin, a very prestigious historian at the University of Chicago, called The Devotional Revolution. And he really traces the rise of the church that we all knew, the puritanical uniformity, to the famine, to the post-famine experience. And that it became a vessel of survival, the Catholic Church. It was the one institution that the people had. It was, they left the public school. In the United States, when you look at the role of the Catholic Church as the educator, as the thing that gave the people internal discipline. They were people kind of adrift. Here again, I think if you look at the black experience, the one institution in black culture in the inner cities is the church. And that's the institution that belongs to the people. And again, it's not all black and white with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church filled, I think, the role that people wanted it to fulfill, and it no longer has to fulfill that role. It no longer does. Which is good for the church and good for the people, I think.
Oh, I would think so too. Yeah, the Irish are a strange contradiction because even though they can be very tender and loving and lovers of poetry and music and things like that, they're also a fierce bunch who aren't afraid to lift their fists if they need to, and that may come out of a cynicism, I'm not sure, but there was a little line that Yeats wrote that I thought might amuse you. He says, "Wine comes in at the mouth, and love comes in at the eye. That's all we shall know for truth before we grow old and die." That's about as cynical as I could possibly think. I don't think Yeats was necessarily considered cynical in general, but...
I don't think he was too good with his fists, either.
That may very well be true, yeah.
But, Yeats, I love Yeats's poetry, but Yeats's view of the Irish is... He celebrates this kind of peasant culture, which he saw has established for thousands of years, and it was the rooted people of most rooted culture of Western Europe. He and Lady Gregory were constantly writing about this. Well, the culture they saw as so rooted and changeless was really another product of the famine. The isolated farmhouse, all this had come, the deserted countryside. This was a very recent development in Irish history. And ironically enough, Lady Gregory's husband, Sir Robert Gregory, had been the author of the Gregory Clause in the Irish Poor Law Extension Act, which helped clear most of the land of peasants, threw them out.
I know that when I had interviewed the poet Jerry Donovan last year, he said that in his mind Yeats was an English poet, not an Irish poet.
Yeah, I think, well, he's an Anglo-Irish poet, which is, there's that too. Certainly that's part of Irish culture, a legitimate part.
Yeah,
I mean, you don't want to you have Parnell, Yeats, Synge. It's not just, there's a legitimate tradition in Ireland of that, I don't think. I think we can claim that as our own, and they can claim, that there are different strands in Ireland. It doesn't all have to be uniform.
Now, I have one more sort of the hot question, I suppose, because I have very mixed feelings about the subject myself, but because of the fact that the Irish Republican Army has classically been defending what we would consider are our opinions in Ireland, how do you feel about their use of violence? Is this an act of desperation, or is it the only way that they can really reasonably deal with Great Britain?
I think in overall, the thought that you're going to bomb the 900,000 to 1 million Protestants into the Irish state, I think it's made things worse. It's kind of confirmed them in their position. I don't believe in armed struggle. I believe in informed struggle. I think that the thing will unite Ireland is culture, really, in the end. And that violence only makes it worse. It only makes the divides harder to get across. And and that the thought that there's going to be any violent solution to the Irish question in the next generation is, it's sad and ridiculous in the end, I think.
It certainly doesn't seem likely.
And, just saying the Irish question, I'm always intrigued by that, by British politicians. In a sense, it's always been a British question, the way the Jewish question was always a Christian question, how Christians would stop treating Jews as pariahs, or the Negro question was always a white question. And the Irish question still remains, I think at some point the British government is going to have to say, there's a timetable to get out like there is in Hong Kong, whether it's 50 years or 75 years, and help define the problem that way. And then force people to sit down and say, what are the compromise institutions we can work out? Because one of the things that with the Northern Protestants is this constant sense that they have a veto over everything. John Hume has said, in a dialogue there has to be a word besides no. And that has been the great Protestant word. And it's been backed up by successive British governments.
Well, perhaps the highest compliment I can pay to someone else's writing is that it makes me want to write. So as an expression of my great pleasure at having read Banished Children of Eve and having the opportunity to chat today with Peter Quinn, and as an offering to all of the Irish and Irish wannabes this Eve of St. Patrick, I've penned the following poem that I'm dedicating to Peter Quinn called Emigrants. 100 the years gone since my Moran fled the pathetic coast of Mayo, longing toward some imagined redress. Today, faces so like my own, familiar as whistle and harp notes, asking, have you been, and when will you get home again? As if 4 generations were but a quick breath in some long narration. Sadly, I cannot say except, I know I will be there soon. And when I am at last, I will kiss the ground softly like the forehead of an aging mother, shake hands with a million cousins, listen for the poems trapped in hill and bog, cast a slack line for a silver rainbow, smell the grass at the castle wall, raise a warm pint of ebony and foam, stand at the cliff, face into the briny breeze, call out to the back of the sky, moisten my blue eyes with the pains of believing, recite in meter every regret, and wonder how the wind carried us so very far away. My gratitude goes to Peter Quinn and to you, the listener. May the wind be ever at your back, and may the road rise up to meet you. This is Dan Moran for the Long Island Radio Magazine. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.
And that's our program for this week. Thanks goes to Peter A. Quinn, and special thanks this week to Dan Moran. And for all of us here at the Long Island Radio Magazine, I'm Rick Lutz saying goodbye and thank you.
WPBX 88.3 FM, Southampton, New York, Long Island's public radio. Good afternoon, it's 1 o'clock. Stay with us. Coming next, it's classical music here at WPBX, beginning with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and it's followed by the BBC Promenade Concerts at 3 o'clock.